From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blessed him that gives and him that takes. From Portia, from the Merchant of Venice. Good evening, Justice Ginsburg, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the Coolidge Auditorium for tonight's very special performance. My name is Elizabeth Pugh, and I am honored to serve as the General Counsel for the Library of Congress. Our law librarian, Jane Sanchez, could not be with us this evening, so I'm thrilled to be able to open tonight's event on behalf of the Law Library of Congress. The Law Library is the custodian of the world's largest collection of legal materials with nearly 3 million items and counting in numerous languages and formats. The Law Library serves all 3 branches of the United States government, the practicing bar, state and local governments, American businesses, scholars, and the world legal community. Throughout the year, the Law Library presents many public programs focused on current legal topics. Coming this fall, look out for events celebrating Constitution Day, Human Rights Day, as well as the Kellogg Biennial Lecture on Jurisprudence. Tonight's performance is the last of a series of 3 events commemorating the 500th anniversary of the establishment of the Jewish ghetto in Venice, Italy. The Law Library previously held 2 lectures, the first one in 2016, entitled The City of the Jews, Segregated Space, and the Admission of Strangers in the Jewish Ghetto of Venice, and another this past February, Understanding Seclusion, the Legal Dimensions of the Ghetto. You can find videos of both of these events on the Law Library's YouTube channel. This event tonight was made possible by a generous donation to the Library of Congress from the American Sephardi Federation. The library also gratefully recognizes a contribution received through the Friends of the Law Library of Congress from Thomas Reuters. And additional support was provided by Mr. Robert S. Roth, Jr. This mock trial was staged last year in Venice, Italy, as part of the city's 500th anniversary commemorations. We are fortunate that the coordinator for last year's event agreed to reprise his role for us in the United States. For his efforts to produce tonight's performance, I would like to recognize Dick Schneider, Associate Dean for International Affairs and Professor of Law at Wake Forest University School of Law. And the only male judge on our bench tonight.
Justice will be done.
And let me introduce the distinguished cast. Arguing on behalf of Portia, Teresa Miguel Stearns of the Lillian Goldman Law Library of Yale Law School. Arguing on behalf of Antonio and the Republic of Venice, Eugene Galland of Covington and Burling. And arguing on behalf of Shylock, Michael Klotz of Jones Day. And now our distinguished panel of judges. Michaela Del Monte of the European Parliament Research Service. Suzanne Reynolds, Dean of Wake Forest University School of Law. Dick Schneider, also of Wake Forest University School of Law. Ambassador Connie Morella. And the judge who needs no introduction, but I'm going to say it, the judge who will deliver the final verdict, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And finally, finally playing the man whose fate hangs in the balance is Ed Giroux as Shylock. I think he'll appear later. Before we get to the trial, you will hear from two speakers. David Dangor of the American Sephardi Federation will help us understand the history of the Sephardic Jews, their connection to Venice, and the diaspora. Michael Kahn of the Shakespeare Theatre Company will refresh our memories on the plot of The Merchant of Venice in order to help frame the scene that you will see on tonight's stage. And then after the judges take recess for deliberations, you will hear from Professor Jim Shapiro of Columbia University, who will go into more depth about The Merchant of Venice during Shakespeare's time. So before the performance begins, I'd like to remind you to kindly switch your mobile phones and other devices to the silent mode. And please note that tonight's program is being recorded as a Facebook live stream and for later presentation on the Law Library's YouTube channel. And now, I would like to invite David Dangor to the stage.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the American Sephardi Federation, I'm very pleased to be able to stand in front of you and be a sponsor of today's interesting event. And obviously, it's a great honor for us to be associated with this distinguished panel of judges and Judge Ginsburg. I will very briefly just tell you something in context about this play and the importance to Jewish history. The American Sephardi Federation is an organization that is strictly cultural and historic, and we study the history and we preserve and promote the history of what I would call the unknown Jews. There's a very large contingent of Jews that come from the Middle East, the Far East, North Africa, and originally some of them from Spain and Portugal. They are largely forgotten in history today, and you will see why we want to be associated with this event. We represent the Jewish history of all these Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, the Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa, the Far East, and importantly, early American history. The Jews came here very early via mainly the Caribbean. So it's therefore a special pleasure today, on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation, to convey that we have since long adopted Shylock of The Merchant of Venice as a Sephardic Jew, i.e. a Jew originating from the mass exodus of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, and in his case, likely from Spain. A specific history that we at the Federation guard and study among several other Jewish histories. There are hints in the Shakespeare play that this very well probably is a Sephardic Jew from Spain. Before I explain, allow me first to outline why in some way the play The Merchant of Venice is to be viewed as a gift to the Jewish people by Shakespeare. This is the perspective. Because of the understandable enormous historical and social attention to the horrors of the Holocaust, there's little focus and interest to remind us today of the terrible plight in Europe for the Jewish people from the latter half of the Middle Ages throughout the early modern period, culminating in the Holocaust and the failed mass attack and attempt to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean in 1948. Because of the brilliance and fame of Shakespeare and the brilliance of his play, The Merchant of Venice functions as a reminder of the long-standing and vile injustice toward the Jewish people. This will continue to help to revisit earlier Jewish history, including, for example, the slaughter of the innocent large Jewish communities along the Rhine River in Europe, southern France, of the detestable Inquisition with burnings at the stake, blind libel, and mass expulsions in Spain, Portugal, and its sideshows in Sicily and Venice, and many other parts of the Mediterranean. At the time of Shakespeare writing the play, there still were many show trials of Jews and so-called conversos, including in Venice. And in England at the time, to use a later term, England was Judenfrei, following their expulsion in 1290 in the Elizabethan era, which was very anti-Jewish. Jews were only allowed back in 1656 under Cromwell, some 60 years after the Merchant of Venice. In summary, wearing a historical hat, it's noteworthy that the play at the time only deals with basically financial matters and not something much worse, which would have been typical of the day. In other words, for this reason, and the famous monologue in the play, optimistically viewed, maybe this is one of the early European and English attempts to humanize Jews. The next attempt in England really only came with Sir Walter Scott's widely popular novel, Ivanhoe, in 1820, with Rebecca and her father being among the lead characters, perhaps even paving the way for Disraeli's ascendance as Prime Minister in England in 1868, 200 years after the Merchant of Venice. The Venetian ghetto, where Jews had to live, was constituted in 1516, as you heard, only 14 years after the Spanish Inquisition in 1492. Several very wealthy Sephardic Jewish trading families fled to Venice, where Jews had been allowed to live more freely in the Venetian Republic. There's little doubt that the ghetto, with its strict boundaries, was a result of the Inquisition fever sweeping the realms of the Catholic Church. The ghetto was divided into two areas, the Ghetto Nuovo, the new ghetto, and the adjacent Ghetto Viejo, the old ghetto. These names of the ghetto sections are misleading, as actually the Ghetto Nuovo is the older one. A large number of Jews from different backgrounds came to live in the ghetto, but over time they never developed a distinct Venetian identity. Instead, they continued strongly to identify with their origins. Therefore, 4 of the 5 synagogues were clearly divided according to ethnic identity in the ghetto. The German synagogue, the Italian synagogue, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, and the Levantine synagogue. There was a 5th synagogue, the so-called Canton synagogue, that was built specifically for a private use by 4 families. The languages spoken at the time in the ghetto included Venetian, Italian, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Arabic, Spanish, French, and German, while Hebrew was traditionally used on signage, inscriptions, and for official purposes, as well as wedding contracts and, of course, in religious services. Allow me, finally, a quick background on the word ghetto. Like with so much about the play, there are different explanations and theories about the origins of the word. Some say the word originates from the foundries in Venice, where the Italian word ghetto is very similar to ghetto, but it's most likely that the word ghetto derives from the Gothic word gatto, which means street. And the reason for that is the Jews throughout the Middle Ages usually congregated along one street where they would have all their shops and places of commerce. So it was very easy to decide to enclose a street like that and put up boundaries and make it into a ghetto. The strict confinement of the Jews in the Venetian ghetto ended with an edict by the 28-year-old Napoleon in 1797, following his conquest and dissolving of the Venetian Republic. That's what you need to know. Thank you.
Good evening. I've been given the task of explaining to you a play that I think you've all seen and read, but I've been told to maybe refresh your minds about the story. Let me tell you that it was first published in 1600, and that Shakespeare, as much of the time, took the stories that he had read that were written earlier. One was the story of the bond of flesh, and the other was the story of the caskets. Now, the Merchant of Venice, we very often confuse the fact, we think because Shylock is such a vibrant character, we think that the Merchant of Venice is Shylock, but indeed he's not. He is the real Merchant of Venice, Antonio, a trader. In the beginning of the play, we find Antonio with several of his friends, young men, among whom are Bassanio and Lorenzo. Bassanio has come to Antonio, admitting that he has spent a lot of Antonio's money trying to better himself and also buying a lot of very good items and clothes that have made him a great man about town. But he tells Antonio that he has the possibility of repaying all of that money again because he has found a beautiful heiress living on an island outside of Venice who is named Portia, and he wishes to vie for her in marriage. Antonio, who says he doesn't have very much money at the moment, but says, for you, I want to do this. And he goes to the only place that he can get this money, and that is to Shylock, who lends money. Shylock tells him first, of course, of how badly he and his fellow Jews have been treated by the Christians of Venice, and yet they come to him for money. But he says, I will do this. And in the process of this negotiation, he says, you know, I am not going to charge you anything. I just want, if you do not repay me in a merry jest, let me say I will take a pound of your flesh to be cut from wherever in your body I wish. Antonio, who has been a successful merchant, finds this actually a charitable request because it's basically impossible. And he comes home with the money, and Bassanio goes off to Belmont to woo Portia. There is another friend of Shylock that we should mention, and that is young Lorenzo. Lorenzo has seen and become attracted to, and perhaps fallen in love with a young Jewess who lives in the ghetto, Jessica. Jessica is Shylock's daughter. At one point in the play, rather early on, Lorenzo abducts Jessica, quite willingly, who leaves the ghetto and her father with a great deal of his money. Shylock is deeply, deeply, deeply distressed by this. Antonio's ventures at sea prove to be disastrous. The ships are wrecked, and Antonio cannot pay Shylock back. This comes very soon after his daughter has been stolen, and Shylock demands that the bond be paid and that the pound of flesh be taken from Antonio's body. There is a great trial, which will be discussed tonight. And in that trial, Portia arrives dressed as a man and pretends to be a lawyer and eventually wins Antonio's suit. This, and Shylock is not only asked to give up his money, but is also asked and told he must be baptized as a Christian at the end of this trial. There is one more act of this play where everybody goes back to Belmont and seems to get along very well. In some productions, in other productions not so well. But it is why Shylock, who ends the fourth act, the fifth act is Belmont, and that is why this play is always put as one of Shakespeare's comedies because it seems to have a happy ending. But there is no question that the resonant issue of this play and the largest character in this play is Shylock and his fate. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight.
Good evening. In this first speech, Shylock expresses his surprise at Antonio's request for a loan. Signor Antonio, many a time and oft in the Rialto you have rated me about my monies and my usances. Still have I borne it with a patient shrug, for suffering is the badge of all our tribe. You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spat upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for use of that which is mine own. Well then, it now appears you need my help. Go to then. You come to me and you say, Shylock, we would have monies. You say so. You, that did void your room upon my beard and foot me as you spurn a stranger cur over your threshold. Monies is your suit. What should I say to you? Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? Or shall I bend low and in a bondman's key with bated breath and whispering humbleness say this, fair sir, you spat on me on Wednesday last. You spurned me such a day. Another time you called me dog. And for these courtesies, I'll lend you thus much monies. In the next speech, Shylock is discussing the terms of the forfeiture of his loan should Antonio default, and he reveals what he values in a pound of flesh. To bait fish withal. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not the Jew eyes? Hath not the Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard. But I will better the instruction. And lastly, Shylock argues in court against using mercy to temper justice in the hopes of receiving the same kindness in God's final judgment. What judgment shall I dread doing no wrong? You have among you many a purchased slave, which like your asses and your dogs and mules, you use in abject and in slavish parts because you bought them. Shall I say to you, let them be free? Marry them to your heirs. Why sweat they under burdens? Let their beds be made as soft as yours, and let their palates be seasoned with such viands. You will answer, the slaves are ours. So do I answer you. The pound of flesh which I demand of him is dearly bought. 'Tis mine, and I will have it. If you deny me, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer. Shall I have it?
We will now proceed with Shylock's appeal. And before we do so, let me caution counsel that the bench is having great difficulty hearing. So if you might tip the podium slightly and speak very distinctly. We will hear first from Shylock's counsel.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. I'm Michael Klotz, counsel for the appellant, Shylock. Before I begin, I'd like to reserve 2 minutes for rebuttal.
You may.
There are two central issues in this appeal. The first issue is whether a party that's entered into agreement and hasn't fulfilled its obligations is able to keep the fruits of the agreement. My client, Shylock, entered into a loan agreement for 3,000 ducats, and the ducats were lent to Bassanio. And Antonio was the guarantor for that loan. And it was for a term of 3 months, and the loan came due, and the money was not repaid. And to this day, Antonio continues to hold the money, and no interest has been paid, and my client has been out of luck. The second issue in this appeal is whether a non-citizen who goes to a court and requests a legal judgment can, in doing so, commit a criminal act. And that's what my client has been convicted of. Shylock went to the court and asked to have the contract enforced, and he asked specifically to have the penalty provision enforced. And unbeknownst to him, Portia was disguised as a judge, and she's not a judge. And she issued a judgment. She issued a judgment against him, and she found that he violated the Alien Act, which protects against any non-citizen attempting to take the life of a citizen. And so in making this appeal to the court, saying, please give me the money that's due under this agreement, Portia said that this was attempted murder. And our argument on that issue is that can't be. It can't be the case that when somebody goes to a court and asks for justice that that's a crime. So we ask that the judgment be reversed without retrial. We ask for the money to come back. We're asking for interest and any other relief that the court deems fit.
I'd like clarification on 2 points. One, Are you demanding the pound of flesh, or have you relinquished that request?
Your Honor, we're relinquishing that request, but we believe that that aspect of the contract was valid and legal.
So you are not demanding a pound of flesh, you're demanding your return of your money. You said interest, but I think the record shows that at the time this loan was negotiated, you said not a doit of usance for my money. You were giving the money, and you were not demanding interest, you were demanding only the pound of flesh. Is it not true that you relinquished any claim to interest?
Your Honor, in that same negotiation, my client referenced that when the loan came due, that he would be given such sum or sums as are due under the agreement. So I think it would be up to the court to examine the contract and determine whether there's prejudgment interest. The prejudgment interest is for the 3-month period of the loan, and the post-judgment interest is from when the loan came due until today.
There's another unusual feature of this proceeding. Antonio is surety. The beneficiary of the loan is Bassanio, but you are not suing Bassanio. You brought a suit against Antonio.
That's correct, Your Honor. He was the guarantor on the loan, and he was the recipient with the Republic of Venice of the money, the underlying money for this agreement.
Even though you knew full well that Bassanio had the wherewithal to pay back the loan, and then there would be no claim against Shylock.
You're correct, Your Honor. We chose the defendants to sue, and we didn't sue Bassanio.
Counsel, why is it that you're asking for the money now when you were offered the money at trial and refused it?
Well, our position has changed, Your Honor. I mean, at trial, we were requesting specific performance, and it wasn't given to us. And then we then asked for the money, and we were told that that was impossible. Portia interpreted the contract in a way that, as I believe the court will realize, is totally improper. She interpreted the agreement to allow a pound of flesh, but to allow no blood and absolutely no more or less than a pound of flesh. So she interpreted the agreement in a way that it couldn't be performed.
Mr. Klotz, what role do you think Portia's deception plays in this proceeding?
Portia's deception is egregious. She's not an attorney. She was not a judge. She was not a part of any court. She obviously misrepresented who she was. And I think perhaps most significantly, she was married to Bassanio, who Justice Ginsburg has pointed out was the obligor on the loan. So she had a direct financial interest in the outcome.
And what specific defense does that give your client?
Well, I mean, if she was actually a judge, she should have recused herself, and because she was and because she was not a judge, the judgment is completely void and invalid.
Should you need a defense, you're the plaintiff in this suit.
Excuse me?
Shylock was the plaintiff suing
Correct.
Antonio.
Correct.
What about the role of revenge? We hear that Shylock repeating that in many different ways, so that he was revenge is connected to his intent. So his intent was for a very fatalistic, ending for Antonio. How do you fit that into saying that you are trying to defend Shylock?
Shylock has been misunderstood, and the point of revenge. It's true that my client and Antonio were not the best of friends, but he had two other motives in pursuing the penalty provision, and he made that very clear during the proceeding. And one of those points that he was seeking is to finally have the chance to have some rights under the law. So the Alien Act is an example of a law that punishes non-citizens in a disparate manner. As we've heard a little bit already, Jewish citizens were forced to live in the ghetto. They had a curfew. They could only take certain occupations. They actually had to pay to have the ghetto patrolled. But as the court is aware, freedom of contract is one of these great things where whatever the generally applicable laws, two people can sit down and agree, this is what you will do, this is what I will do, and they make their own law, essentially. And so my client was very angry and very upset when in this one aspect of his life that he could control, his rights were not being recognized.
We heard that Shylock was in a state of extreme distress. Are you making any plea that he would be incompetent to have been accused of a criminal action because he was so distraught at his daughter's elopement and her theft of his worldly goods?
Your Honor, we're not arguing that Shylock was incompetent. We're arguing that, first of all, he didn't have an intent to murder Antonio. His intent was to rebel, to protest against this circumstance that he found himself in. And on the second point, that even if the court were somehow to find that he had an intent to murder, there's no act of doing anything. He can't be convicted for murderous words any more than anyone else could, saying, I want to do this. I mean, his situation, Your Honor, would be comparable to a murder trial where a parent comes in and says to the court, this man should be executed, and then that person was arrested for murder. I mean, that would be a relatively similar situation.
I thought you started out with the point that he couldn't be tried for murder when all he did was bring a civil suit to enforce a contract.
Yes, Your Honor. No, I don't. I think both things are true. I think that it's totally inappropriate, and it's totally inappropriate that any request of a court could be a criminal act. And so for that reason, I don't think it's possible to convict him under the Alien Act. I don't think there's any way that this can be attempted murder. And separately, and a not inconsistent point, he didn't do anything. I mean, during this scene, he had a knife, and he said some words that he may regret. But nothing else happened.
But the question of motive is important to us. It's important in terms of thinking of what Shylock did and how we should rule here. I mean, one motive is revenge, which obviously would be caught up with the murder. But you make an argument in your brief, and that you just mentioned a minute ago, that Shylock was in fact, in a sense, rebelling through this contract. I'm not sure I really understand what you mean by that. Maybe could you elaborate a little bit on that for us? What do you mean what was Shylock doing here if it wasn't revenge?
Yes, Your Honor. So, I mean, the attempt to enforce the penalty provision was a rebellion against the Venetian laws that treated him so differently, and then this is the one area where he was able to do something. He was able to sort of set the terms of his life. And the other part of it is during the proceeding, what Shylock points out about Antonio and the other Venetian merchants is the incredible hypocrisy. Venetian capitalism, there's trade in many things, but one of the main aspects of trade was slavery. And so it seems very hypocritical and improper that merchants like Antonio should be able to grow wealthy selling people against their will, and my client should not be able to recover the penalty provision, even though there's a physical component to it.
You know, I'm trying to understand that there was a contract. They actually made a legal contract, even though Shylock said something about it being a merry joke or something, which meant that they fully expected the money would be returned on time. But then he perseveres for the pound of flesh. But then when he finds out about the blood, you know, and he says he wants it by the heart, did he think it could be done in some other way so that Antonio would not die? I mean, what did you find out in your investigation of this case? What he had in mind?
Shylock did not intend to murder Antonio. It was a pound of flesh. It was not a dagger in the heart or anything like that.
He wanted it near the heart. Yeah.
He wanted it near the heart, but the court doesn't know any more than I do if he'd been granted that. If Portia had granted him that right and she'd enforced that right of specific performance, he might have dropped the knife and asked for the money instead. I mean, there's no way to know at this point.
In any case, the money, we have settled that the pound of flesh is out of the case now. It's just a matter of money.
Yes, Your Honor. No, we're not seeking the pound of flesh, and after all this time, we're not trying to come and have that be enforced.
But if you're seeking, Mr. Klotz, if you're just focusing on the civil action and you're not seeking the pound of flesh, you're seeking only the repayment of the money plus interest. Isn't this a claim not raised below? This is an appellate court. Did you raise this claim below?
That's a great question, Your Honor.
Thank you.
I take it you're seeking a substitutional remedy since the one you asked for, the law does not permit.
Well, what I think, Your Honor, is, the proceeding was obviously, it was totally improper with Portia acting as the judge, but the other main point that we haven't discussed yet, but is discussed in the brief, is the incredible duress for my client during the proceeding. First, Portia says, you can get the pound of flesh, you don't get blood, you don't get any more or less than that. Shylock then asked for the money and was told no. Portia then said that he violated the Alien Act supposedly for making this request of the court, and then Shylock was forced to convert to Christianity, and the Duke said very clearly if he didn't do that, then he was going to be executed. So to the extent that there's a waiver argument, I think that maybe we can let that slide. But we're asking this court, in addition to follow up on your point, besides the civil remedy, which is the return of the 3,000 ducats and the interest, we're asking to have my client's name cleared after all this time. There's nothing that we can do about this improper verdict other than to completely nullify it.
You made a comment about the Alien Act. Are you arguing that the Alien Act in itself, and maybe you could explain exactly what that is, but the Alien Act, are you arguing that that is somehow illegitimate, or are you just simply saying it was wrongly applied to Shylock?
The Alien Act is totally illegitimate. I mean, it's an act that has completely disparate treatment of a certain group of people. It protects Venetian citizens in a way that non-citizens would not be protected. If somebody were to have made an attempt to murder my client, Shylock, that wouldn't have been a violation and nothing would have happened whatsoever. And just to give an example from our case, the Duke saying to Shylock, if you don't convert to Christianity, I'm going to execute you.
But
That
didn't
seems
the
very
Duke
similar.
consider that the only chance that Shylock had for salvation, so far from being a penalty, it was a tremendous advantage to Shylock to be converted to a Christian, so then his soul could be saved.
You're absolutely correct, Your Honor. I think that's what he believed.
But in other words, the Duke was acting mercifully, and Shylock, who Portia begged to act mercifully, never did. Shylock refused up until the last minute to renounce the pound of flesh.
We can't dispute, Your Honor, that Shylock didn't act with all of the mercy that he could have in this proceeding. But I believe that the factors that we've talked about, the treatment that he experienced, his view that if he doesn't have his rights under the contract, what rights does he have? He's already treated in this totally unfair and disparate way. And the audacity of Antonio to act as though this penalty provision that he'd agreed upon and they'd talked about in detail and they'd negotiated and they'd reduced to writing was somehow an outrage, and Shylock was beyond the pale in trying to enforce the terms that they had agreed on.
Do you say he did not violate the alien rule because he didn't actually perform anything against Antonio, even though he may have wanted to?
That's exactly right, Your Honor.
Okay, your time is almost up. So do you want to just quickly sum up?
Yes, Your Honor. To reiterate, we ask the court to once and for all vacate the decision below without leave for retrial of my client, that the 3,000 ducats be returned in full, that he be awarded interest on that money after all this time, and that the court award such further relief as you think is appropriate, particularly in light of what he and other Jewish residents in Venice suffered.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
We will now hear for counsel for the Merchant of Venice, Antonio, and the Republic of Venice.
Thank you, Your Honor, and may it please the court. I want to begin by rejecting the transparently false narrative that we've been presented with here. The notion that Shylock was engaged simply in a noble and honorable protest of what he thought to be the deficiencies and unfairness of Venetian law. That is simply not true. Never until this appeal have we heard that argument. And indeed, if we look at the record of the case again and again and again, it shows that Shylock entered into a premeditated and deceitful course of action in order to lure Antonio into sealing a bond that would be the means of his own destruction. And there are four critical elements in this scheme that are undisputed in the record of the case. First, throughout, Shylock admitted to his motives. Even before he negotiated the penalty bond, he was overheard to say, quote, speaking of Antonio, "I hate him, for he is a Christian. If I can catch him once on the hip, I will feed fat the ancient grudge I bear him." In fact, we heard Shylock himself a few minutes ago say that the pound of flesh would be used to bait fish withal, and that further, he would use that pound of flesh to feed his revenge. Other evidence of the motive of revenge and hatred abounds throughout the record of this case. But if there were any doubt, it would have been satisfied when at his trial, in response to questions by the Duke, he explained that his motive was a, quote, lodged hate and a certain loathing, end quote, for Antonio.
Counsel, before we get into your discussion of the merits of a criminal prosecution, I think you conceded at the outset that that turn of the proceedings from a civil suit to enforce a contract into a criminal case was highly inappropriate. Did you not make that concession in your brief?
Well, I think we have two responses to that, Your Honor. The first is that Antonio was permitted to use as a counterclaim and as a defense any law that would be available to him.
Can you bring in a civil case, a criminal prosecution, as a counterclaim?
Yeah, absolutely. Under the under the law of Venice at that time, this kind of pleading was recognized. But as we argued in our brief, Your Honor, we have an additional point, and that is we do agree on one point with Shylock, and that is that the procedures were flawed by reason of Portia's misrepresentations and masquerade. And for that reason, we've asked this court to consider the case de novo.
Well, Judge Reynolds reminded us that this is a court of review, not of first view. De novo, we would be looking at the case as a court of first instance, but we are an appellate forum. So we have no authority to hear witnesses. We judge the case according to the law. So I don't understand how you can ask this court to serve as a first instance, de novo court.
Well, even if this court should decline to consider the case entirely anew, the opportunity through representation by very able counsel and the opportunity to make all of his arguments ensures that Shylock now has the right to argue against the application of the alien law to him.
And if the proceeding is improper, then I suppose an appellate court should just dismiss it. And if it dismisses the case, then where are we?
Well, if this court simply dismissed the case, then I think it would put Antonio and the Duke of Venice in the position that they would want to be in, because it would deny any and all relief to Shylock.
But you're not urging us to do that because you recognize that he did not get a fair trial, is that it?
We grant that the procedures were not fair procedures, yes.
Let me go to what seems to be your principal argument, that this was an act of vengeance on Shylock's part. But Shylock, when the transaction took place, called it a merry sport, a merry bond. And the really puzzling aspect of your position that it's all vengeance. At the time this bargain was made, Shylock had every reason to think that Antonio, rich merchant of Venice, would be able to repay him. He had no idea of the supposed tragedy at sea. He expected, as Antonio did, that Antonio would be, his wealth would be increased well within the time of the loan.
I think the record shows that from the very beginning, Shylock was scheming to trap Antonio. He deceived Antonio. He said to Antonio at the time that they were discussing the bond that he was offering the loan for reconciliation and friendship. He said, quote, "I would be friends with you and have your love," to Antonio. As you point out, he jovially referred to the penalty bond as a merry sport. And he quickly added that it was worthless. Nobody could expect him to ever claim the bond because a pound of a man's flesh taken from a man is not estimable, profitable neither as flesh from muttons, beefs, and goats.
But what basis did Shylock had to even suspect that this question would arise, to suspect that Antonio would not be able to repay him? Antonio is a rich merchant. There was no premonition of storms at sea. Why would you attribute to Shylock such a motive of vengeance when Shylock had every reason in the world to expect that within the 3 months' time he would be repaid?
He was laying a trap. He understood that he would probably be repaid, but he also understood that if he were not, this would be his opportunity finally to have the revenge that he sought so dearly. And there's a little noticed fact that is very interesting in this case, and that is when he first heard about the opportunity to have a penalty bond from Antonio, he didn't have the money. Shylock didn't have the money. And so what did he do? He went to his moneylender friend, Tubal, and borrowed the money to lend in order to get the penalty bond. In other words, he was willing to pay interest to Tubal and make a loan free of charge. And that was to set up the trap. And it shows that throughout, from the very beginning to the very end, that even though he recognized that he would probably be repaid, the trap could be set, and he would have his revenge if he was not repaid.
One thing that Shylock was very clear about, he said it a few times, he said, "I crave the law," but no one told him what the law was. Nobody told him about the Alien Act. So it's obvious case of no notice or opportunity to rethink the case in light of the law. But Shylock craved the law. Once he's told what the law is, then the pound of flesh is off the table.
The pound of flesh is not a valid penalty bond under Venetian law. Venetian law, it's true, enforced commercial terms. The penalty bond here is not a commercial term. In fact, Shylock himself admitted many times that it was not a commercial term when he said that he would gladly give up repayment of 20 times the loan in order to enforce the penalty bond.
But what about the state of mind of your client, Antonio? Why did he agree to this so swiftly?
And just to follow up on that, I have a problem with that as well. I mean, it's not hard for me to understand why Shylock would want this bond, whether we think it was revenge or whether we think it was, political expression of some sort. But why would Antonio agree to be bound by this bond? Why would he agree to give up a pound of his own flesh just to get money for Bassanio? And what I'm thinking here is really, is it possible that Antonio was the one laying the trap for Shylock? Because Antonio knew that Shylock would be hit with the Alien Act.
Well, there's no evidence in the record to suggest that
Well,
that was the case.
there may not be reference in the record to that, but I'm just speculating.
Well, may I interject that there are multiple clues in the record. When we first meet Antonio, he said, "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad." He later says, "I am tainted whether of the flock, meetest for death." So this is a very sad man who is longing for death.
I think he snapped out of that depression. But to answer the question, Antonio was fooled. He was taken in by the reconciliation and friendship that he thought were being offered by Shylock. And in fact, Antonio, just as he was going and sealing the bond, said, quote, "There is much kindness in the Jew," end quote. And I have to say, although he's my client, that Antonio was easy prey in another sense. He was a profoundly, extravagantly proud man with an extravagant and exaggerated sense of honor. And Shylock, cunning as he was, preyed on this character defect of Antonio. And he did so in the following way. He recognized that if it ever came time to enforce the penalty bond, that Antonio would be too proud to dishonor it. That, in other words, he would admit it. And that's exactly what happened. Antonio didn't hire a lawyer. Antonio offered no defense. Antonio confessed the bond and offered himself up to be killed. And that's exactly what Shylock's scheme was. He knew that Antonio would not resist and that there would be no genuine court proceeding standing between himself and his opportunity to kill Antonio. And that's why the argument that there was an intercession of a court proceeding is a defense doesn't work, because Shylock, taking advantage of this character flaw, knew that there would be no meaningful judicial protection of Antonio.
Speaking of being taken advantage of, don't you think Shylock was, in a way, in that he never got due process? And he never had anybody to advise him of what the consequences would be, or what the journey through the law would mean for him. Is it not amazing to you that you take a civil case and it ends up being a criminal case? And so should he not have been given due process along the way?
Well, let's take it in steps. In the negotiation of the penalty bond, I think that Shylock, as a very experienced moneylender, was very knowledgeable about the applicable law. And it shows that regardless of the criticisms we have of Venetian law, court proceedings were open to Jews in Venice, and the protection of the laws were applicable to them. You are right that when his case got to court, the charade, Portia's masquerade, did deny him due process, and we entirely agree with that. We think, however, that on the basis of the record and the devastating admissions repeatedly made by Shylock, that he properly stands convicted of the offense of which he was found guilty.
But how does the Alien Act come into the picture? You just said that Antonio wasn't putting up any defense. He certainly didn't raise the Alien Act. It was this sham lawyer, Judge Portia, who brought that.
Well, our brief points out that the intervention of Portia indeed saved the life of Antonio. It also saved the life of Shylock. And it saved Shylock because Shylock was ready, willing, and able to kill Antonio. The notion that Antonio would have been spared by Shylock is absolutely crazy. The record shows Shylock was earnestly sharpening his knife in the court, that Shylock had a balance scale in order to measure the pound of flesh. He was ready to do it, and it was only Portia that saved Antonio and also saved Shylock from himself.
Counsel, I'd like to ask a question here. I think we'd all agree that the record is beautifully written, but that it's rather thin, at least of the court proceeding. And I believe that you are asking us to draw a lot of inferences from the record. What about this inference, that Shylock never believed that the court would allow him to exact his pound of flesh? He does seem surprised in the court proceeding when Portia says, "You're right, you may enforce the penalty bond," and he praises her and sounds very surprised. Why isn't it as reasonable inference as you would have us draw that he was willing to put the knife to Antonio's heart? Why isn't it equally a valid inference that he never thought that the court would allow him to exact this measure, enforce the penalty bond literally?
Well, with all respect, we don't think there's any question of inference because we have the man's words. Again and again and again, those words evince nothing other than an intent to execute Antonio, to have revenge, and to realize the long-standing object of his hatred, that is the killing of Antonio.
But that's another inference. I mean, as Justice Ginsburg pointed out, he did say, Shylock said on several occasions, this is a merry bond. This is nothing to be worried about. And he does appear surprised when Portia says, "You're right, you win." Why is it not a proper inference for us to draw that he might have, since you want us to draw some inferences from the record, why isn't it appropriate to draw that inference as well?
As I read the record, beautifully written as it is, I'd characterize Shylock's reaction not as surprise, but as exultant delight.
Counsel, your time is about to run out, so you would like to
Thank you.
conclude.
For the reasons argued in our brief and the arguments that I would have made if I'd not had so many good questions, we believe that the judgment below was correct and that this court should arrive at the same judgment on its own initiative. Thank you.
Including conversion.
Absolutely, including conversion. That's to save the eternal soul of Shylock.
We will now hear from Portia's counsel.
Justice Ginsburg, and may it please the court, I am Teresa Miguel Stearns, counsel for appellee Portia. Some 400 years ago, Portia provided legal advice to the Duke of Venice. In a commercial contract dispute between appellant Shylock and co-appellee Antonio, this commercial contract dispute almost turned deadly. Portia's skillful navigation of Venetian law saved both men's lives. As a direct result in her role in this Shylock-Antonio dispute, Portia has suffered unjustified, targeted attacks to her reputation over the course of the last 400 years. Today, Portia asks that she be discharged from this case and from any future related proceedings. Your Honor, we have 5 points to our brief. However, the heart of our argument is first and foremost that Portia is the wrong defendant appellee in this case, and secondarily, that Portia's alleged misrepresentations to the court and alleged interest in the outcome of this matter are without merit or at most harmless error. And I will turn to those matters now. First, Portia is the wrong defendant appellee in this case. Counsel for Shylock is well aware that the Duke of Venice ruled the city in the 16th century. Portia's role was merely to provide legal advice to the Duke of Venice, who was the ultimate arbiter in this case.
Well, Portia, although she was not a lawyer, we can recognize that she knew something about the law. And surely she would have known that for Portia to give counsel to the Duke and to Shylock to stand there unrepresented, which he was willing to do when he was a civil plaintiff, being prosecuted and no counsel, apart from your conflict of interest, being married to the principal debtor, isn't that just overwhelming?
Your Honor raises 3 points, and I would like to address them all. First, that Portia was not learned in the law. The record demonstrates that Portia was indeed learned in the law. And in 16th century Venice, one did not need a university diploma or any type...
I am conceding that she was learned in the law. Maybe I misspoke or you misunderstood. Portia is learned in the law. She had to be such a trickster. But she is displaying her learning for the benefit of the Republic of Venice and Antonio, and Shylock is standing there with no one to represent him. He is the target of a criminal prosecution. Doesn't he have a right to counsel?
Your Honor, on the issue of notice, it was Shylock who dragged everyone into court. Bassanio, the Duke of Venice, and others tried to convince Shylock to settle this case amicably and financially prior to coming to court. But Shylock craved his bond. Shylock wanted his pound of flesh, so he brought everyone into court on a civil proceeding. This case never turned into a prosecution. Portia was never a prosecutor, and the Alien Act remained a civil forfeiture case. As soon as Portia explained to the Duke of Venice what was involved in the alien statute, before Shylock had to utter a word, the Duke of Venice immediately said, no, we are not going to consider this capital punishment case. We will keep it as a civil forfeiture case, and Shylock's estate was the only thing in jeopardy. Shylock's life or freedom were never in jeopardy throughout the course of these proceedings.
But Shylock never knew that the law put him in that position. He said repeatedly, I crave the law. Had he been counseled, he would have known what the law was and escaped the forfeiture.
Respectfully, Your Honor, ignorance of the law is no defense. And in this matter...
But having no counsel to tell him what the law was.
Your Honor, respectfully, many people tried to convince Shylock to settle this case prior to it becoming the civil forfeiture case required by the Alien Act. In fact, when Portia first encountered Shylock, when she entered the courtroom, she said, who is the Jew and who is the merchant? She placed both people, both participants in this trial, at the same level in the eyes of the law.
She said, who is the Jew? Not who is the lender and who is the borrower.
Right, that's correct, Your Honor. This is what the transcript shows.
We have another clue to Portia's character. So she calls Shylock a Jew. Back in Belmont, when Morocco appears, she said, we don't need people of that dark complexion. So we know that this is a woman who entertains certain biases.
Your Honor, Portia had a very distinct idea in Belmont that she wanted to marry Bassanio. They had laid eyes on each other in the past, and she was hoping that Bassanio would be the suitor who would correctly guess the box, the casket that her father laid out.
Was Portia free to marry anybody she wanted to?
No, she was not, Your Honor. Portia was a wealthy orphan whose life was dictated by her late father. Her late father had provided for her education, but had also provided the method for dictating who her husband would be.
And that may have been very patriarchal, but she spoke about Morocco's burnished skin. There was her love for Bassanio surely did not require her to so disparage people from Morocco.
That's correct, Your Honor.
So we recognize that she has certain biases based on race against Morocco, against Shylock.
I would pick up on that. I see that clearly as a conflict of interest. As a conflict of interest, the unclean hand, because of Bassano, and she was to gain from this situation.
Yes, regarding the conflict of interest, Portia is alleged to have had both a financial and a personal conflict of interest in this case. I will address both. First, the financial conflict of interest. From the very beginning, Portia offered her own ducats to settle this case with Shylock. Even before she and Bassanio were married, she offered her ducats to Bassanio to help settle this case amicably. When Portia first walked into court, she pleaded with Shylock to settle the case. Financially, 2 times the amount, 3 times the amount, 10 times the amount of ducats, of her ducats, were offered to Shylock to settle this case. He refused. She brought in the quality of mercy speech, where she says, the quality of mercy, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath.
And where was her mercy?
Your Honor.
Just a little bit later, she is urging Shylock, be merciful. And then she turns on him and said, I have no mercy for you.
I believe Your Honor is referring to the Alien Act, and it is actually Portia's mercy which saves both of their lives. When Portia is merely providing legal advice to the Duke of Venice. When Portia realizes that she is not able to convince Shylock to amicably and financially settle this case, she grants him specific performance on the contract, and that is to take the pound of flesh. But at the moment that Shylock is ready to carve out a pound of flesh from Antonio's chest, Portia stops the proceeding, strictly interprets the contract with the reference that was made earlier, in that a strict interpretation of the contract would require no more, no less than a pound of flesh, and not any other matter, no blood, no other matter, no bone, no organ. At that point, she also advises the Duke that Shylock's actions, Shylock's attempt to murder Antonio, which is not in doubt at this point, is punishable by the Alien Statute.
But you're telling us then that the contract, it was impossible to enforce the contract. So the pound of flesh has to go by impossibility. Everyone knows you can't take flesh without blood as well. So then what would happen if he can't get the remedy he's demanding? He would get a substitutional remedy. He would get the ordinary remedy for breach of contract, that is, in this case, his money back.
Your Honor, Respectfully, this contract was enforceable under the laws of Venice. This is a commercial contract, and Venice, as the international commercial hegemony that it was, required strict enforcement of all commercial contracts. The Duke knew this. Antonio knew this. Antonio even said this to his friends as he was going into court.
But if Portia is correct, the contract is impossible to enforce because you can't take flesh without taking blood. That is an impossibility.
Your Honor, it is my understanding that with a very hot knife, one can take flesh without blood. Your Honor, Portia's interest in this case was to make sure that both men walked out of the courtroom alive, not one on a stretcher having his chest carved out and bled to death, and not the other being dragged off to the hangman's gallows to meet his own demise. This is the sign of a merciful judge, not a conflicted one.
Ms. Miguel Stearns, I believe it's your position that Portia did not engage in any misrepresentation. Is that right? You've certainly pointed to facts in the record that do support the conclusion that she was very learned in the law. But didn't she engage in misrepresentation? And if so, doesn't that taint the proceeding so that the judgment should be set aside and there should be a retrial?
Your Honor, the only misrepresentation that Portia made was disguising herself as a man. That she was a woman had absolutely no bearing on the outcome of the case. She was legitimately in the court, having been sent there by Dr. Bellario to provide legal advice to the Duke of Venice. The Duke of Venice did not want to enforce the contract, even though he felt he needed to, because the laws of Venice need to be strictly enforced in order to retain its, as I mentioned,
Did Bellario know that Portia was married to the principal debtor in this case?
Your Honor, the record is not clear on that point. However, Dr. Bellario did know that Portia was learned in the law and very capable of providing appropriate legal advice to the Duke. Dr. Bellario wrote a letter personally to the Duke and attested to the Duke that he and Portia had reviewed the facts of the case, had turned over many books together, they had reviewed the appropriate law in this matter, and that Dr. Bellario furnished Portia with his opinion, which, on top of Portia's own legal acumen, would provide superb advice to the Duke of Venice. Dr. Bellario knew that she was going to disguise herself as a man and actually gave her the robes to do so. Dr. Bellario was a trusted legal advisor of the Duke of Venice, and he was ill that day, so he sent Portia in his stead. Portia had no conflict of interest in this matter other than to see the dispute resolved amicably and see both men alive.
Did she not at some point at the end reject Shylock's request for repayment?
Yes, Your Honor, she did. And that is because multiple times throughout the course of the proceedings, Shylock had been offered to settle the case financially. At some point, when he finally said, no, I demand my bond, and Portia advised that specific performance would be the only remedy, at that point, any negotiations are off the table. Venice is a place of no takebacks. You don't get two chances in Venice. Once they passed the point of settling the case amicably and financially, that door was closed. There's no right to say, oh, well, I guess I can't take my pound of flesh, so okay, let's go back in time, I'll take the money and leave. That is just not the law in Venice.
Portia's motivation to get involved in this, I don't quite understand the way you're characterizing it. She decides to get involved after she's heard that Antonio has lost his ships. She says that she decides that she must help Antonio because Antonio must be a wonderful person since he's the best friend of her husband. And at that point, she decides that she's going to play this trick. Doesn't that motivation in and of itself show that she is deeply conflicted here in terms of her interests in the matter?
Your Honor, as I've mentioned, Portia is not conflicted in this case. It's true that Bassanio and Antonio were friends, but Portia had never met Antonio. Portia had never met Shylock. Portia was only concerned about providing proper legal advice and ensuring that both men walk out of this case alive.
How can you say that when the only reason she went to Bellario and the only reason she then went to Venice was in the interest of her husband?
Your Honor, Portia, as a woman in 16th century Venice, had very limited opportunities to pursue a career. This was an opportunity not only to save the life of a friend of her husband's, but also to put her legal education to use. She knew that Dr. Bellario, her cousin, would properly recommend her, and Dr. Bellario would not have recommended a cousin, someone who wouldn't be able to provide legal advice, much less a female cousin, to send into court, putting his own reputation on the line, providing advice to the Duke of Venice. Dr. Bellario was a trusted advisor of the Duke of Venice. He was a career member of the legal community, and he would not have put his entire career on the line for Portia. Your Honor, I see my time is up. If I may just close by saying that Portia requests, once again, that she be discharged from this case and relieved of any liability in this matter. Portia did not have a conflict of interest. Her appearance as a man did not affect the outcome of this case. She was qualified to provide legal advice, and but for Portia's legal acumen, Shylock would have murdered Antonio, and Shylock himself would have been executed. Rather, Portia, despite attempts over and over again to convince Shylock to show mercy, she saved both Shylock's and Antonio's lives with her skillful navigation of Venetian law. But even if this court does not agree that Portia acted sincerely, Portia is the wrong defendant appellee in this case. The appellee should be the city-state of Venice alone. Portia was merciful, and in that spirit would be wholly in favor of this course reversing the Duke of Venice's order that Shylock convert to Judaism, just as Portia would have liked to have freely and openly practiced law in 16th century Venice, and so she persisted. Thank you for your generous time and your merciful attention.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.